So my name is Darren Gertis. I'm a professor who's been studying what's going on in the war in Ukraine since the early days of March. In a couple of days, I'll be actually presenting a paper at an academic conference on Zelensky's leadership in the first 100 days of the war. So I have been paying attention. What you see on screen here are, since day 85, I have been doing these daily updates of what's going on just because I've been fascinated by this, by the dynamics, by how Ukraine has been so clever in figuring out how to overcome and adapt against the odds. Today, I want to talk about particularly about the use of drones and the actions and reactions related to that. But I want to start here. Estonian parliament declares Russia a terrorist regime. So PACE did this a few days ago. PACE is not um, uh, a governmental body. It's an extra governmental body. And so while that was big, I was saying this is important because it'll cause others to add on. So Estonia is one of the first that has done this. And now that Estonia has done, Latvia, Lithuania, probably Poland will not be far behind. And then you're going to see a number of other countries declaring Russia a terrorist state. And this is huge. I mean, I can't explain how huge this is politically. Now, remember Estonia. We're going to come back to this in the very last article I point you to, okay? Just remember Estonia. Okay, so here are the drones. This is what a drone looks like, Iranian drone, and they're using them to some good effect. The Russians are using them to some very effectively in creating a terror in Ukraine. Dramatic images of kamikaze drones slamming into Kyiv on October 17th firmly discredited Tehran's denial. So Iran is denying that they're supplying these weapons, though. Like, it's kind of like, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? I mean, we're seeing them use these weapons. Some people have, theoretically, some people have shot them down with small arms fire. That's going to be exceedingly hard. Michael Boyle is a professor at Rutgers, New Jersey. He wrote a book on drone warfare. He said that what you're seeing now is indicating that Russia's stockpiles of missiles is actually diminishing. Now, Russia has shot something like 200, roughly, I'm not saying 200 exactly, roughly 200 missiles. And when I say missiles, I mean like cruise missile kind of missiles that are $1 million, $2 million each, into Ukraine in the last 10 days. So and again, they're not hitting military targets. They're trying to hit infrastructure like a power plant, or just creating havoc. And, they're fine if it hits a residential building and creates terror. These are what the drones look like. You can fast launch about 5 of these at the same time, so they can kind of swarm at whoever the target is. Yeah, so these are just some of the pictures. This is what the actual damage can look like. So it's pretty intense. Boyle says the recent kamikaze drones barrage appeared to mark a shift in punishment strategy. In other words, just keep pounding Ukrainian civilian targets with repeated drone strikes to punish the population and demoralize them with blackouts, fear, and degraded quality of life. Now, I think this is right. It's an attrition strategy, just like what we saw with Mariupol, just like what we saw with Severodonetsk. It's just and it's an aerial assaulting attrition strategy. And so who can be the last one standing? That's the real question. Here's another article about the same kind of thing. This is in The Guardian. The last article was Radio Free Europe, and the one before that was Interfax Ukraine. And I try to triangulate on different news sources to get a fuller picture. Iran agrees to supply missiles as well as drones to Russia. So they're running low on missiles. We all know that. Iran is deepening its commitment to supply arms to Russia's assault on Ukraine by agreeing to provide a batch of medium-range missiles. Now, what's interesting about that is yesterday I was talking about how they're talking about supplying Ukraine now with some of their perhaps Iron Dome or some other air defense systems, because their mortal enemy is the Iranians. Now, it's interesting if you just take a step back and you think, like, who is the enemy of who? A lot of this game starts to really make sense. Iran on Tuesday repeated its denials of selling drones to Russia. They've denied that they've done it, even though it's very clear. and called for talks with Ukraine to resolve the accusations, but Tehran at the same time asserts it's fully entitled to sell arms abroad since restrictions on arms sales contained in the 2015 Iran nuclear deal expired in 2020. The US, France, and the UK say missile sales are a breach. And clearly they are. Ukrainian intelligence says that they have 1,750 drones, each costing about 20,000 to manufacture, that have been delivered. That's a lot of drones, and that can do a lot of damage. And it's kind of scary. GPS-guided Iranian Shahed 136 drones can fly up to 1,500 miles. They pack a payload of about 40 pounds of explosives. And so it can be pretty damaging. And this is the real trick to the drones. They don't have much of a radar signal, so you don't know they're coming until you hear something that sounds like a lawnmower buzzing overhead. So that's the story with the drones. Okay, one more. Russia's use of Iranian drones exposes it as militarily and politically bankrupt. Zelensky said that for decades Russia spent billions of dollars on its military industrial complex, and in the end they bowed to Tehran to get their rather simple drones and missiles. Okay, that's a good point. Iran denies supplying drones to Russia, but British intelligence, US State Department both believe that they're there. They have seen the proof. So they can deny all day long, but we know that that's what's happening. That can't be a good feeling to know that something's coming. You can hear it kind of in the distance, but you're not exactly sure when it's going to come from or exactly where, if you're in danger. The Ministry of Defense in the UK says that since October 10th, Russia has maintained a heightened tempo of long-range strikes against targets across Ukraine. Their military tempo has been terrible. Russia on the ground has not been doing very much. In fact, it looks like they're going to withdraw from Kherson. Or from the northern side of Kherson across the river, and they're signaling this right now. These have been conducted by cruise missiles, air defense missiles in a surface-to-surface role, and Iranian-provided Shahed 136 drones. Okay, here's the Institute for the Study of War talking about the same kind of thing. Russia forces continue to target critical civilian infrastructure with air, missile, and drone strikes on October 18th, launching 19 missile strikes, 68 air strikes against 10 areas. And they list all the cities here. October 10th to October 18th, Volodymyr Zelensky stated that they destroyed 30% of Ukrainian power stations, and the goal is to demoralize. Now, if you put them in a blackout, that's bad, but remember, winter's coming, and if you can destroy the power stations before winter, you make it absolutely miserable for Ukraine. I don't think that the Ukrainians are the types that are going to knuckle under. They're going to endure very cold winters and burn wood and whatever else they need to do, but they're not going to knuckle under because of that. I'm pretty sure. I think Putin continues to miscalculate. Okay, Nordstream 1. This is really interesting. We heard about the Nordstream 1 pipeline damage, and I'm going to show you, this is in The Guardian, and they showed footage of what the Nordstream 1 pipeline looked like underwater. They dropped this camera, and like huge sections of it are just gone. I mean, like it's pretty remarkable. Like it's not supposed to be open like that and have like this gaping hole, and that's just the end of the gaping hole, and it's I'm trying to see how many meters it was, and at least 50 meters of the gas pipeline appeared to be missing. That's really, really, really remarkable. So okay, so that's just on the side. Last thing that I want to talk about before we turn our attention to fun with Russian state media is Russia's new Ukraine commander signals civilian evacuation from a tense Kherson. And I'm not going to go through this article. I'm going to do it with fun with Russian state media. So the first article I want to talk about here is Russian general in charge of Ukraine operations speaks out. Okay, he described the situation as particularly tense around the city of Kherson, and in his statement to the broadcaster, he added that the military may be forced to make difficult decisions. Now remember, this is on Russian state media, and so it's setting up the people there, and Denis Davdov, I'm going to credit him, gave a great explanation of this, like he's softening them up for when they withdraw from this northern area in Kherson. Now that'll be great if they withdraw from here, but it's bad at the same time. It's great because you're taking the real estate back, and I think that's wonderful, but you got to kill the soldiers on there as much as you can before they can escape, because right now they're kind of bottled up. There's no bridges here. It's very hard to get across the river, so if you just let them escape, they'll have a strong front line line across here, but it's going to make it more difficult as you try to take more ground. I'm not against them taking ground, take the ground, but yeah, it's a which problem do you want to live with kind of thing. Okay, next. Tehran breaches a nuclear deal with drone supplies to Russia, says the U.S. And they're reporting that on Monday, the U.S. on Monday accused Iran of breaching the conditions of the 2015 nuclear deal by selling kamikaze drones to Russia. Moscow, however, stated it's only using Russian hardware. And I'll show you the proof, they say. Okay, so we scroll down a little bit, and they say Tehran has denied providing arms to either side of the conflict in Ukraine. And they have, because they lie. In the same way that Russia lies when they say we aren't hitting civilians, and you can see it with your own eyes that they're hitting a civilian residential complex or a park or a city street. They lie. The same way the Iranians lie about supplying this. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters on Monday that he had received no information concerning alleged use of Iranian drones in Ukraine. That's not the same as saying absolutely categorically they're not using it. He just received no information. Russian hardware is being used, he said, adding, "You know it well. It has Russian designations." Huh. Well, you know, he's right. The Russians couldn't have imprinted the Russian designation on that because that would be too difficult. He thinks we're stupid, but this is the stuff that's being spouted, and it will be retweeted, it will be repackaged, it'll be plagiarized wholesale, and it'll be in Indian and Asian and Islamic media because that's what they're doing, and they know that. Okay, Moscow comments on alleged use of military Iranian drones. It sounds like the same thing because it's a repackage of the same article with no additional information, just a repackage of the way that he says, no, we have no such information. Russian hardware is being used. You know it well. So this is what we have for media in Russia. Remember, you can go to jail for 15 years for speaking out against the military. So I'm a little reluctant to trust Russian sources about this. Okay, the answer to the question of why Putin will not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine is simple. This was an interesting article for a couple of reasons. The West sometimes tries to use logic to understand what is really happening. Well, I mean, I would say that's probably a good idea. The answer to the question of why Putin will not use nuclear weapons is simple. And he goes down and it says, according to Peter Van Buren, a well-known author at the American Conservative, U.S. President Joe Biden believes that Putin is allegedly at odds with his head because of the fear of defeat in Ukraine that may ultimately lead to regime change in Russia. I think that's a pretty fair analysis. Putin's got to be really concerned right now, trying to figure out, like, there's no off-ramp. For Putin, my analysis is he's got to win. He has no option B. He has no way of making peace. Or if he can make peace, he's coming back in 10 years to try to finish the job. But there's no way that the Ukrainians are going to make peace. So he just got to keep going. He doesn't have much of a choice. But the article goes on to say, at the same time, however, this is not the case at all, because there will be no Russia's defeat in Ukraine. What? Like, this can't possibly be. Okay. Regime change also seems unlikely, the political scientist notes, adding that nuclear strike is the last thing that Russia wants. Okay, and I hope that he's true. I mean, I hope that that's true, that it's the last thing that he wants. But what they always do in these articles, and you see it again here, the United States and NATO have been preparing to fight Russia and Ukraine for almost 70 years. No, they haven't been preparing to fight Russia in Ukraine for 70 years. Russia and Ukraine were united in the Soviet Union for a long time, and NATO has been a defensive alliance against additional Soviet gobbling up of other nations. So there's kind of true, but kind of also not. And they have used every tool for the hostilities to start. Okay, so again, it's a blame the West kind of thing, but this is consumed by Russia. This is Pravda RU, and then it's consumed by other nations as well. Okay, a report on alleged Ukrainian war crimes presented to the UN. Okay, big headline, right? Oh, Ukrainian war crimes. Many people don't read past a headline, but here's a subheadline. The transgressions are related to at least 2 cases. You are freaking kidding me. You're talking about 2 cases when the Ukrainians have tens of thousands of cases of war crimes, and this is what you're presenting to the UN. I'm not even going to go through the rest of the article. It's laughable. Okay, and then this is the last article, but stay with me because I told you when we were talking about Estonia, we're going to come back to that at the end. You'll see why. Former Tokyo governor, Ukraine has always been a traitor country. Okay, now what they very often do in Russian media is they find somebody to cite who, it's not just them saying it. They'll find a political scientist said, or a former, prime minister or governor or something says this, and then they'll cite whatever it is that they said that lines up with what they want. Okay, former Tokyo governor, Ukraine has always been a traitor country, according to Mazui. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. My Japanese is worse than my Ukrainian, which is not very good at all. The armed conflict on this territory of Ukraine comes as a direct consequence of the terror that Kyiv unleashed against Moscow. Kyiv unleashed against Moscow. Okay, and then he traces it back historically. At the time of the 1917 revolution, there were more than 100 ethnic groups living within Russia. When the Romanov dynasty fell, national questions arose sharply. Ukraine demanded federalization and autonomy. Right, because they had been captured and they wanted to be their own country. So as far back as 1917, you're seeing Ukraine going, no, we want to be our own people. So this should have been the first warning that, like, hey, Ukraine, they want to march to their own beat. But then we have the October Revolution. And February 9th, 1918, Ukraine concluded peace with Germany without cooperating with Moscow. As a result of the deal, Ukraine received military assistance from Germany in exchange for 1 million tons of grain to fight the Bolsheviks. Yes, those guys over there are oppressing us, so you're kind of a bad guy too, but we'd rather have you bad guy than that bad guy, and that's what's going on here. At that time, the agreement with Germany was a stab in the back of Russia. Well, it's also trying to get away from the ones that were enslaving you. Then Lenin's forced to conclude the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, I could be pronouncing that wrong, that forced Russia to cede Finland, Poland, the Baltic states, remember I talked about Estonia earlier, and Ukraine to Germany. Russia thus lost 26% of the population, a quarter of the arable land, a third of produced grain, a quarter of railways, a third of industry, 75% of metallurgy and coal industry, okay, in this treaty. Now, I'm going to come back to this. Let's look at the treaty. The Treaty of Brest in Russia was a separate peace treaty signed on March 3rd between Russia and the Central Powers. The way that we process this in the West is this is what took Russia out of the war. Okay, now, but there's more to the story here. As a result of the treaty, Soviet Russia, which had just become Soviet, it was Russia before, defaulted on all of Imperial Russia's commitments to the Allies. 11 nations became independent in Eastern Europe and Western Asia. Under the treaty, Russia lost nearly all of Ukraine. Russia also lost 3 Baltic republics, such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Now, here's why this is important. Estonia understands that when Russia says, we're just taking back what was ours, Estonia was once ours. Finland understands that when Russia says, we're just taking back what was ours, Finland once was ours. That's why they ran headlong in I remember in the first few days watching the news as the Finnish president or prime minister, I don't remember what it was, came to Washington, and he was getting agreements from Biden for protection because he wasn't part of NATO, and they were moving headlong into NATO because they could see the writing on the wall. Because, and this is why Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are the most ardent allies of Ukraine right now. Percentage giving, it's the Baltic states above everybody else giving the most. Okay, and 3 Baltic republics became German vassal states at the time because it was better to be subdued by these guys than by those guys. Okay, and then finally, the last thing here is I agree fully with this final statement. Today, 100 years later, history is repeating itself. The world is watching how it will end, but the knowledge of Russian history is useful for analyzing the current situation and predicting the future. He's right. Knowledge of history is very important in understanding what's going on, but I have a different interpretation of what actually happened. The Ukrainians wanted independence then. They want independence now. 100 years from now, if they don't have it, they're going to be still fighting for independence. Okay, that's all that I have to say today. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares enough about Ukraine to spend this time watching this video.